Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
It's great to be back.
Today, we're going to be looking at this really fascinating figure, Ibn Taymiyya,
Oh, yeah.
a 14th century Islamic scholar.
Mm.
And we're going to be diving deep into a selection of his writings called Selected Writings of Ibn Taymiyya.
Makes sense.
And basically, we're trying to understand how he describes God's attributes.
Okay.
Now, I know theology can sound kind of heavy sometimes, but trust me, this is going to be fascinating.
Oh, I think so.
Ibn Taymiyya didn't just lay out doctrines.
Yeah.
He debated, he challenged, he argued his points with real passion.
Oh, absolutely.
So are you ready to dive in?
I am. I'm ready. Let's do it.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
So one of the first things that really struck me about Ibn Taymiyya is how he tackles this big question of what it means for God to exist.
Right.
You know, this is a question that's puzzled philosophers.
Well, for ages.
For ages. And Ibn Taymiyya comes in with a really bold statement. He says that God's existence isn't this separate thing that's like tacked onto God.
Right.
It's not like God has existence as a quality.
Yeah.
Instead, it's way more fundamental than that.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Well, he says God's existence, his essence.
Wow.
They're totally inseparable.
Okay.
They're one and the same.
So it's not even like a quality?
No.
Okay.
To put it simply, God doesn't have existence. God is existence.
Mm-hmm.
And this was revolutionary because
Yeah.
many scholars at that time saw existence as something distinct, almost like a quality God possessed.
Okay. I'm already feeling my brain stretch a bit.
Sure.
So what does this actually mean for how we understand God?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Is there like a way to wrap our heads around this
Yeah.
without getting lost in philosophical jargon?
Think of it this way.
Okay.
Imagine a fire.
Okay.
Can you have fire without heat?
No way.
Right.
They're like the same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The heat isn't something added to the fire.
Right.
It's inseparable from its very nature.
Yeah.
For Ibn Taymiyyah, God's existence is like that.
Okay.
It's woven into the very fabric of who God is.
I think that analogy really makes it click for me.
Good.
But Ibn Taymiyyah didn't stop there, did he?
No, he didn't.
He goes on to explore God's attributes.
Yeah.
Like knowledge, power, speech, and those get even more complex.
Well, he does. And this is where it gets even more interesting.
Yeah.
He starts by asking this question.
Yeah.
Are God's attributes separate things that are somehow stuck onto God?
Okay.
Or are they something else entirely?
I can already see where this is going.
Yeah.
So what's his take on that?
Well, Ibn Taymiyyah was really into the Arabic language.
Right.
And he pointed out that the words for essence and attributes actually evolved in meaning over time.
Okay.
So building on that, he argued that God's attributes aren't some separate add-ons.
Okay.
They are inherently and inseparably part of his being.
So they're not added to God.
They are God.
They are God.
Wow.
And this was another point where he was pushing back against other scholars.
Okay.
Some denied God had any attributes at all,
Wow.
while others saw them as these distinct external things.
So he's finding like a middle ground.
He is. He's really making a point about God's unity and absolute nature.
So he's saying God's knowledge, for example, isn't some separate file folder that God has tucked away somewhere.
Exactly.
It's part of the essence of who God is.
That's it.
You know, it almost sounds like Ibn Taymiyyah is walking this tightrope here. He wants to affirm that God has these amazing attributes.
Right.
But he's also really careful not to fall into any traps along the way.
You're exactly right. And that's what makes his work so fascinating.
Yeah.
He was deeply concerned with avoiding anything that could distort or misinterpret how we understand God's attributes.
So what were some of those traps that Ibn Taymiyyah was trying to avoid?
Yeah.
What were the dangers he saw? He specifically warns against 4 main errors.
Okay.
Tarif, tatil, takif, and temthil.
Those are some big words.
Yeah, they're Arabic terms.
Right.
Don't let those words scare you.
Okay.
They're actually pretty straightforward once you kind of break them down.
Okay, so give me the Ibn Taymiyyah crash course here. What did they mean to him, and why was he so concerned about them?
Okay, so tarif, the first one, basically means twisting the meaning of God's attributes.
Okay.
Like forcing them to fit a human understanding.
Gotcha.
Takel is the opposite.
Okay.
It's like hitting the delete button
Yeah.
and denying God has any attributes at all.
Okay, so he's trying to find that middle ground, affirming that God has attributes,
Right.
but not distorting them or denying them altogether.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the other two, Takif and Tamthil?
Right. Takif is trying to explain exactly how God's attributes exist.
Okay.
Like trying to draw a diagram of God's knowledge. Ibn Taymiyyah saw that as going way beyond what humans can grasp.
So it's not for us to know, basically.
All right. It's beyond us.
Okay.
And finally, Tamthil.
Yeah.
This is a big one.
Okay.
Is comparing God's attributes to human qualities.
Like saying God's love is just like human love, only bigger.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ibn Taymiyyah would say that's a dangerous oversimplification.
Oh, okay.
We can affirm that God is loving,
Right.
but we shouldn't try to box in that love based on our limited human experience.
You know, I'm starting to get a sense of just how careful and precise Ibn Taymiyyah was in his thinking.
Absolutely.
It's like he's saying, we can talk about God's attributes.
Yeah.
But we need to do it with reverence and humility, recognizing that we're dealing with something that's ultimately beyond our full comprehension.
That's a great way to put it. And this is where his criticism of other scholars comes in.
Okay.
He specifically calls out these groups like the al-Taqil,
Okay.
al-Tawil, and al-Taqil for falling into these traps.
Okay.
Each group, according to him, was making a fundamental error in how they understood God.
Okay, so can you give us a specific example from his writing?
Oh, sure.
That really shows his concern with avoiding this anthropomorphism.
Certainly. So he tackles this concept of God's establishment on the throne.
Okay.
Or istia.
Okay.
Now, this was a thorny topic. Some scholars took this literally, imagining God physically sitting on a throne.
Oh, wow.
But Ibn Taymiyyah said, hold on, that's not what this means at all.
So he's directly challenging a very literal interpretation
He is.
of a phrase from the Quran.
Yes.
It's pretty bold.
It is. He insisted that we should not understand this phrase in a physical, spatial way.
Okay.
He said God is not like a human king confined to a throne.
Right.
God is far beyond such limitations.
So how did Ibn Taymiyyah suggest we approach understanding these complex ideas about God?
That's a great question.
If he's so wary of human reasoning and oversimplification, what was his method?
Well, he emphasized relying solely on the Quran and the Sunnah, the Prophet Muhammad's teachings and practices, as the ultimate sources of knowledge about God. He was very skeptical of philosophical speculation that went beyond these revealed scriptures.
So he's saying, let's stick to the primary sources. Let's ground our understanding of God in what's been revealed.
Exactly.
That sounds like a pretty traditionalist approach, wouldn't you say?
It is.
Okay.
He believed that the Quran and Sunnah provided the clearest and most authoritative guidance on these matters.
Okay.
And this even connects to his fascinating perspective on the term tawil, which is often translated as interpretation.
Okay, Ibn Taymiyyah and the concept of tawil.
Exactly.
Tell me more.
Okay, well, he actually identifies 3 different ways to understand tawil.
3 different ways.
Yeah, and this shows us just how deep his thinking goes.
Okay, you've got my attention. Break it down for me.
Okay.
How did Ibn Taymiyyah understand tawil?
Well, the first way is how most people understand it.
Okay.
Moving from the more obvious meaning of a word to a less obvious one.
Yeah.
Like if you say, the sun smiled.
Right.
You don't mean that literally right.
No.
You're talking about sunshine in a more poetic way.
Right, you're finding like a deeper layer of meaning.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the other 2?
The second way is similar to tafsir.
Okay.
Which is basically explaining a passage from Scripture. And this explanation might not always match the most obvious meaning of the words.
Right.
The focus here is on getting to the real heart of what that passage is trying to convey.
So it's not just about interpreting the words themselves.
Right.
It's about understanding the deeper message behind them.
Exactly.
That's the third way.
Okay, so the third...
You said it was the most fascinating.
The third way is really profound.
Okay.
Ibn Taymiyyah saw tawil as the ultimate reality that a word points to.
Okay.
Something that only God truly knows.
Okay.
Imagine descriptions of paradise in the Quran.
Okay.
Beautiful gardens, flowing rivers, all these sorts of things.
Right.
The tawil of those descriptions isn't just our human interpretation.
Yeah.
It's the actual reality of paradise.
Oh, wow.
Which is something that we can't even fathom right now.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So he's saying there's this whole other level of meaning that's beyond our human understanding.
Yeah.
It's almost like there's this hidden dimension to the Quran that we can only glimpse through revelation.
Exactly.
That's fascinating.
And this ties back to his emphasis on relying on the Quran and Sunnah.
Okay.
He's saying, look, we can use our reason to try to understand these texts.
Right.
But there's a limit to what we can grasp on our own.
Right.
We need to approach these scriptures with humility.
Yeah.
Knowing that there's always more to uncover.
It's making me think about how I approach religious texts in general. It's so easy to get caught up in our own interpretations and opinions. But Ibn Taymiyyah seems to be calling for this deeper level of surrender and trust in the revealed word.
I think that's a beautiful insight.
Yeah.
And, it's not just about surrendering to the text.
Right.
It's about surrendering to the one who revealed the text.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So we've talked about how Ibn Taymiyyah emphasized God's transcendence, the limitations of human language, and his deep respect for revelation.
Yeah.
What other insights did he offer about understanding God's attribute?
Well, he spent a lot of time talking about how we should avoid anthropomorphism.
Okay.
Attributing human qualities to God.
Right.
It was one of his biggest concerns.
Yeah.
And it pops up again and again in his writings.
We touched on this in the last segment, but I think it's worth revisiting.
Sure.
Why was he so adamant about this?
Yeah, why was he so concerned about anthropomorphism?
What did he find so dangerous about it?
For Ibn Taymiyyah, it all came down to preserving the absolute uniqueness and transcendence of God.
Okay.
He believed that any attempt to make God too human-like was a form of idolatry.
Wow. Okay.
It was like we were trying to shrink God down to a size we could comprehend.
Right.
And in doing so, we were missing the whole point.
So it's not just about avoiding silly comparisons like, God has a big white beard.
Right, exactly.
It's about something much deeper.
It is.
Recognizing the vast gulf between our finite human minds and the infinite nature of God.
Exactly.
He was constantly reminding his readers that God is beyond our grasp. We can learn about God through his names and attributes, but we can never fully enclose the divine within our limited human categories.
It makes me think about how we often use metaphors and analogies to try to understand spiritual concepts.
Right.
Ibn Taymiyyah seems to be saying those metaphors can be helpful, but we always need to remember that they're just pointers, not the destination.
I love that analogy. It's like we're using a map to try to find a treasure, but the map can only take us so far.
Right.
At some point, we have to step off the map and experience the treasure for ourselves.
And that experience
is the experience of knowing God.
Yes, exactly.
So if Ibn Taymiyyah is so cautious about anthropomorphism, how did he approach those descriptions of God that do use human-like language? Like when the Quran talks about God's hand, about speech.
That's a really important question.
Yeah.
And it gets to the heart of Ibn Taymiyyah's method.
Okay.
He actually identified 3 different ways to understand those kinds of descriptions. And it all goes back to that idea of tawil.
Okay, so tawil is back in the picture.
Yes, it is.
Remind me again, what were those 3 ways of understanding tawil?
Okay, so the first way, remember, is the basic one.
Yeah.
Moving from an obvious meaning to a less obvious one.
Okay.
So you might say,
the
hand of God is upon the believers.
Right.
And you don't mean that literally.
Right.
You're using hand as a metaphor for God's power and protection.
Okay, that's the metaphorical interpretation.
Yes.
What about the second way?
The second way is more like explaining the text.
Okay.
Even if the explanation goes beyond the literal meaning.
Right.
So you might say, God's speech is not like human speech.
Okay.
It's something far more profound and powerful.
Right.
You're trying to get at the deeper meaning behind the words.
So it's about understanding the essence of what's being conveyed, even if the language is symbolic.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about that third, more mystical understanding of tawil?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Ibn Taymiyyah said that the ultimate tawil of these descriptions is something that only God truly knows.
Wow.
It's the reality behind the words.
Yeah.
The essence of God's attributes.
Okay.
Which is beyond our human comprehension.
So we can use these human words to point towards God, but we can never fully capture the infinite reality of God.
That's right.
In our language.
Exactly.
It makes me rethink how I even approach these kinds of descriptions in Scripture.
Sure.
It's so easy to get caught up in trying to figure out the right interpretation. But Ibn Taymiyyah seems to be saying sometimes the most important thing is to just recognize the mystery and allow ourselves to be humbled by the vastness of God.
I think that's a beautiful insight.
Yeah.
And it speaks to a deeper theme in Ibn Taymiyyah's work.
Okay.
The idea that true knowledge of God
Yeah.
is not just an intellectual pursuit.
Right.
It's a spiritual journey.
So it's not just about knowing the right doctrines or
Yeah.
having the right answers.
It's about cultivating a heart
Yeah.
that's open to the mystery and wonder of God.
Yeah. You know, it's like that famous saying,
What's that?
it's not about getting to heaven, it's about letting heaven get into you.
I love that.
Yeah.
And I think Ibn Taymiyyah would totally agree.
Yeah.
He saw the pursuit of knowledge about God
Right.
as a path to spiritual purification and
Yeah.
closeness to the divine.
This deep dive is really shifting my perspective on these theological discussions.
Right.
It's not just about abstract concepts anymore.
Right.
It's about a living relationship with God.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
And it brings us to another important point that Ibn Taymiyyah made about God's attributes.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that they're not separate entities that exist apart from God.
Yes, very important point.
We talked about this a little bit before, but it's worth unpacking further.
Absolutely.
What did he mean when he said that God's attributes are inherent and inseparable from his essence?
Ibn Taymiyyah was really pushing back against this idea that God's attributes were like little add-ons or accessories.
Right.
You know, like God has this big bag of attributes and he pulls out knowledge when he needs to know something or power when he wants to do something.
Right.
He believed that kind of thinking was a major distortion of God's unity and perfection.
So he's saying that God's knowledge, for example, isn't a separate thing that God possesses.
Right.
It is God.
It is God.
It's part of the very fabric of his being.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this.
Sure.
Is there an analogy that can help make this click?
Think of the sun.
Okay.
Can you separate the sun's brightness from the sun itself?
Nope. They're one and the same.
Exactly.
You can't have the sun without its brightness.
And that's how Ibn Taymiyyah saw God's attributes.
Okay.
They're not external to God.
Yeah, right.
They're woven into the very core of his being.
So he's basically saying that God's knowledge isn't like a light bulb that God can switch on and off. It's like the sun's radiance.
Yes.
A natural and inseparable expression of who God is.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, that image really helps.
Good.
And this idea is deeply connected to the concept of tawhid, which is the Islamic principle of God's oneness.
Yes.
Ibn Taymiyyah believed that true tawhid requires recognizing that God is absolutely unique, indivisible, and cannot be fragmented in any way.
So for him, affirming God's attributes was actually a way of upholding God's unity.
Exactly.
Not contradicting it.
Yes, he saw the denial of God's attributes as a form of diminishing God.
Right.
Reducing him to something less than he truly is.
It's like he's saying, if we truly believe in God's oneness, then we have to recognize that his attributes are not separate entities. That exist outside of him. They are expressions of his very essence.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see how all these ideas fit together.
Yeah.
It's like Ibn Taymiyyah is building this intricate tapestry.
Weaving together threads of language, logic,
and revelation.
And create a picture of God that's both awe-inspiring and humbling.
It's a beautiful image.
And it highlights the importance of approaching these theological discussions with both our minds and our hearts engaged.
Absolutely.
It's not just about having the right answers or winning arguments.
It's about something much deeper.
It's about cultivating a deep sense of reverence and wonder for the one who is beyond all our words and concepts.
I think that's a key takeaway from Ibn Taymiyyah's work.
Yeah.
He invites us into a relationship with God that's both intellectually stimulating and spiritually transformative.
This deep dive has definitely made me rethink my own understanding of these concepts.
Good.
It's easy to get stuck in our own limited ways of thinking about God, right? But Ibn Taymiyyah pushes us to expand our minds and embrace a more expansive view of the divine.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
He reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge about God is not just an intellectual exercise.
Right.
It's a spiritual journey that can lead to a deeper and more profound relationship with the divine.
This has been an incredibly rich and thought-provoking conversation so far.
Yes, it has.
We've explored so many facets of Ibn Taymiyyah's thinking.
We have.
His emphasis on God's transcendence and unity. his nuanced approach to language and interpretation, and his deep reverence for revelation.
Yeah.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
Oh, we have. There's so much more.
Ibn Taymiyyah's work is a treasure trove of insights.
It is.
And there's so much more to uncover.
Absolutely.
Well, before we head into the final part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with a question to ponder, dear listener.
Okay.
Ibn Taymiyyah was so adamant about avoiding anthropomorphism and recognizing the limitations of human language when talking about God. But he also insisted on affirming God's attributes in all their fullness. How do you balance these seemingly conflicting ideas? How do you hold on to the mystery of God while also striving to know and understand him?
That's a profound question.
Yeah.
And it's one that each of us has to grapple with on our own spiritual journey.
We'll be back soon to explore some more of Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas and see what further insights he has to offer on this fascinating topic.
Absolutely.
Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive into the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah.
You know, it's interesting. As we've been exploring his ideas about God's attributes, I'm really struck by how he manages to be both incredibly precise but also incredibly open at the same time.
Yeah.
It's like he's all about drawing these boundaries to protect the majesty of God, but he's also inviting us into this incredible world of wonder and exploration. That's a great observation. It's like he's saying, look, there are some things about God that are simply beyond our grasp.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we should just, stop seeking knowledge and understanding.
Exactly. And he gives us some pretty clear guidelines for how to navigate that exploration, right? Like he talks about those 4 pitfalls to avoid when we're talking about God's attributes. Tarif, Tatil, Taqiyaf, and Tamthil.
Right. Those were his big warnings.
Yeah.
He was basically saying, if you want to understand God, you need to steer clear of these intellectual traps.
Okay, so let's do like a quick recap for our listeners.
Okay.
What were those 4 traps again, and why was Ibn Taymiyyah so concerned about them?
Well, Tarif was all about distorting the meaning of God's attributes.
Right.
Like twisting them to fit a human agenda.
Right, so we're not putting our own spin on things.
Exactly.
Right.
Tartil was the opposite.
Okay.
Denying that God has any attributes at all.
Right.
Which Ibn Taymiyyah saw as like this theological emptiness.
So those 2 were about staying true to the revelation.
Yes.
Not adding to it or subtracting from it.
Exactly.
What about Taqif and Tamthil?
Okay.
Those seemed a bit more subtle.
Taqif was about trying to define exactly how God's attributes exist.
Right.
Like we're trying to draw a blueprint of God's knowledge or build a model of God's power.
Okay.
Ibn Taymiyyah would say that's way beyond our pay grade.
Yeah.
We simply can't grasp those mysteries with our limited human minds.
So it's like trying to dissect a rainbow to figure out how the colors work.
Exactly.
You're missing the beauty and wonder of the whole thing.
Exactly. You got it.
And then finally there's Tamthil,
right,
which is comparing God's attributes to human qualities.
Yes. This was a huge red flag for Ibn Taymiyyah.
Yeah.
Because he saw it as a form of idolatry.
He was really concerned about keeping God's transcendence intact.
Absolutely.
Like he didn't want us to try to shrink God down to a size that we could manage.
Exactly. He was constantly reminding us that God is infinitely greater than anything we can imagine or conceive.
Right.
We can use human language to point towards God.
Yeah.
But we can never fully capture God in our words or in our concepts.
It's like trying to fit the ocean into a teacup.
Exactly.
That's just not possible.
You got it, and that's where that concept of tawhid comes in again, that beautiful Islamic principle of God's absolute oneness.
Yeah.
Ibn Taymiyyah believed that affirming God's attributes was a way of honoring that oneness.
Okay.
Recognizing that God's qualities are not these separate entities, but expressions of his very essence.
So I'm starting to see how all these ideas fit together. It's like Ibn Taymiyyah is building this intricate tapestry, weaving together these threads of language and logic and revelation to create this picture of God that's both awe-inspiring and humbling.
That's a beautiful image. And it highlights the importance of approaching these theological discussions with both our minds and our hearts engaged.
Absolutely.
It's not just about having the right answers or winning arguments.
Right.
It's about cultivating a deep sense of reverence and wonder for the one who is beyond all our words and concepts.
I think that's a key takeaway from Ibn Taymiyyah's work.
It is.
He invites us into this relationship with God that's both intellectually stimulating and spiritually transformative.
And as we wrap up our deep dive today, I think one thing to really take away from Ibn Taymiyyah is this idea that the pursuit of knowledge about God, it's not just an intellectual exercise.
Right.
It's a spiritual journey.
Yeah. It can lead us to a deeper and more profound relationship with the divine.
And, you know, as we've been talking about all this, I've been thinking about how it can apply to our lives today.
Yeah, me too.
We live in a world that's obsessed with explaining everything.
Right.
With reducing complex realities down to sound bites and slogans.
Right. Everything has to have like a simple answer.
Exactly. But Ibn Taymiyyah reminds us that there's a certain beauty and power in acknowledging the mystery.
Yes.
And accepting that there are some things we'll never fully grasp.
Yeah. And in a world that's constantly trying to divide us, you know, categorize and label everything, Ibn Taymiyyah's emphasis on God's unity is just so refreshing.
It is. It reminds us that at the heart of reality, there's this unifying principle, a source of love and connection that transcends all our differences.
That's beautifully said.
Thanks. And I think it points to a deeper truth that Ibn Taymiyyah was really trying to get across. That ultimately, our knowledge of God is not just about accumulating information. It's about deepening our relationship with the divine.
It's not just about having the right doctrines or beliefs.
Exactly.
It's about allowing our hearts to be transformed by the love and wisdom of God.
Well said.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Ibn Taymiyyah's writings, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge.
Okay.
Don't just take our word for it.
Right.
Go explore his work for yourself. Grapple with his ideas.
Absolutely.
And see how they resonate with your own heart and mind.
I think you'll find it very rewarding.
And who knows? You might just find that the journey itself is the greatest reward.
Exactly. And always remember that the pursuit of knowledge about God is a lifelong adventure.
It is.
It's a journey that takes us to the very depths of our being.
Yes.
And it's a journey that is worth taking.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of Ibn Taymiyyah.
It was my pleasure.
We hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as we have.